We hear a lot about the small wars around the world, but they're not small if you're in them. Can we make a difference? We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. War and political violence have horrific consequences for civilians in today's seemingly endless global hotspots. What can be done for those innocent bystanders who are being denied the right to live in peace? How might we better assist them in recovering from the abuses they've suffered? And, as uncomfortable as it sounds, why are we partly to blame? Our guest today, Samantha Nutt, is a medical doctor turned humanitarian. She has spent the last 15 years on the front lines of the world's most horrifying crises, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Somalia to Congo to Darfur. Her new book, Damned Nations, Greed, Guns, Armies, and Aid, tells the story of her personal efforts to right the wrongs that war and political violence impose on ordinary people. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nutt.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Thank you for being here today. Tell us how you embarked on this effort to save people and fix situations around the world. You were in medical school and then you graduated. Was this what you always thought you were going to do?
No, I think I'm kind of the accidental activist. I had spent quite a lot of time as a medical student really interested in health and human rights and the relationship between the two. And then I ended up, after graduating from medical school, I was doing a degree in international development. And I ended up getting a contract offer from UNICEF to work in Somalia. And this was the mid-1990s, and it was right at the tail end of Operation Restore Hope. And it was also just at the tail, just in the middle of the Rwandan genocide. So there were literally, hundreds of international organizations that had been in Somalia that then withdrew and went on to Rwanda. And as a result, many organizations, but in particular the UN, UNICEF, they were desperately trying to figure out how they were going to meet the growing demand. And insecurity was a constant challenge. So they presented me with this offer to do work in Somalia to look at the health needs of women and children, which was what my thesis research was on. And I accepted. And it was a volunteer contract that was for $1. And it was given to me by a man named Pierce Garrity, who is a lawyer from Yale, American lawyer from Yale, who was the head of UNICEF Somalia. And I remember joking with him on the tarmac in Kenya that I wanted half the money up front. And he slipped me 2 quarters and wished me good luck. And that was the beginning. And that experience in Somalia profoundly changed me and set me on the path I'm on.
Did you ever think about personal safety and security in the early days? Because you were going into some very, very dangerous environments.
Absolutely. You know, I've always taken my security very seriously. I don't think, at 25, I don't think that I really fully appreciated just how insecure Somalia was. And I think that if there was one emotion that kind of dominated the relationship between the international aid community and Somalia's at that time, it probably would have been contempt. I mean, things were so tense between the two groups as a result of Operation Restore Hope and everything that had happened. And so, you know, you really were a target. And at that time, that was the exception. Somalia was really one of the hardest places to work. It still is one of the hardest places to work, if not the hardest. But other war zones I worked in after that, there was a concept of a humanitarian space, and you could be protected within that space. That's changed, particularly over the past decade, and security situations for aid workers have really deteriorated. But at that time, it really surprised me the extent to which we were literally moving targets. And in those situations, it doesn't matter. You can wear a flak jacket, you can wear a helmet, you can get advanced security briefings, but there are times when the front line ends up right on top of you, and certainly I did experience that at least once in Somalia.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, I was up in the northern part in an area called Bosaso, and I was in a camp for internally displaced people, and I was the only female on our team, and so I was tasked with going into this camp and interviewing women. There was a resurgence of cholera, and many children were dying, and it was a very strange thing because I'd gone from tent to tent interviewing these women. And they were all walking several kilometers to get water, even though there was an international organization that had a water sort of canteen available to them, a water reservoir. And I thought this was very strange. And so, but no one would tell me why they continued to walk into town. So I ended up going over to the water reservoir, and there was a little boy, and he was taking water from it. And I took a picture because I wanted to be able to show that, you know, here you have a great solution. You've got fresh drinking water, and it's being provided by an international organization, and you've got cholera. And so, you know, this is really a question of public education. That's what I thought it actually was at the time. Took this picture. And next thing I know, I'm surrounded by guys with AK-47s, pointing them at me, screaming at me, telling me I'm not allowed to take a picture, wanting to take my camera, all my things. I was a long way from our vehicle because I was right in the center of this camp, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know whether they were going to kidnap me. I didn't know whether they were going to shoot me. I had no idea. And fortunately, at that moment, the UN car came around the corner. And we had guards, and everybody was screaming and yelling, and there was gunfire, people were shooting up into the air. And I can remember the driver of our car, our UN driver, jumped out, and he grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and he threw me into the back seat of the car, onto the floor. And there was more gunfire and people screaming, and we just tore off. And I was really lucky. I was really lucky. I found out in the end that the reason why this had happened was because the owner of this camp, who owned the land, had been extorting money from the internally displaced people to use the water reservoir, even though it was being provided by an aid agency. And when I took the picture, after I'd gone door to door talking to these women, he thought that I was taking the picture to report him. And so he'd sent his personal security guards, he called them.
Gosh, so that was a big learning experience for you. And did that, how you handled that, how it was handled by the people you were with, did that help you in future incidents that you faced in other countries? Because you probably came into very, very similar circumstances in other places.
You do. I mean, there are occasions when there are things that just happen like that, that are beyond your control and that you're not aware of, and no amount of preparation can ever prevent those things, car ambushes, things like that. But certainly it made me much more aware of my circumstances and the environment, and it also made me aware that you can think that you're doing something relatively innocuous, and at the end you may actually be doing something that's quite dangerous, and you really have to be experienced and prepared and aware of what can happen.
Now, have you ever been actually kidnapped and held someplace against your will?
Thankfully, no. There was one time in Eastern Congo when I was there filming a documentary, actually, for MTV, that was airing on MTV, and we were with a group of musicians, and there was a skirmish at the border, and we were about 1 kilometer from the border with Rwanda, and all hell broke loose, I mean, quite literally, and so we were bunkered down in the basement, hiding out for a couple of days. We ended up having our whole group. There were about 30 of us, including a number of Congolese people and Americans and other foreigners, and we were ended up having to be evacuated by armored personnel carriers because it was a really close call. So I've been in situations where it's been really difficult to get out.
How do you choose the locations you visit? Do you have a list of just really, really terrifying places with huge problems that you go down, or are you inspired by something you've seen or heard about in a particular location and you figure that's somewhere where you can do some good?
Well, the work that I do, I run an organization called War Child, and we work in war-torn countries, and our focus is on education and poverty reduction initiatives and strengthening the rights of women and children. So we do longer-term development initiatives, but in complex humanitarian emergencies, so war-torn countries, post-conflict countries. So we have a number of criteria that we use, and that determines where we go. So obviously it has to be either at war or recently emerging from war, but we also work in communities that have at least enough of a goodwill and infrastructure that they want to begin that process of reconstruction and rehabilitation. Often they're areas where you have a number of kids who were fighting as combatants, who are returning, who've been demobilized, returning refugees, people who are trying to rebuild their communities and return to their lives. And so those tend to be the places that we target. But it's usually the countries that you can imagine. I mean, it's Eastern Congo, it is Northern Uganda, it is South Sudan, Darfur, Afghanistan, we've worked in Iraq. So it tends to be places that are high need.
I always thought that the children were most at risk in these places, like they are in so many other parts of the world, partly because they're so impressionable at that age and they learn behaviors and they use weapons and things. How do you bring them back to the mainstream after that experience?
Well, it's really tough, and I do get into this in Damned Nations in the book because I've done a lot of work with kids in war zones, but also with child soldiers more formally. And it's really difficult. You know, many of these children are kids who were abducted from their homes at the age of anywhere from 4 to 8 years of age, sometimes a little bit older. Sometimes to indoctrinate them into the militias, they're forced to kill immediate members of their families so that they no longer want to flee to run home because there's no home for them to go back to or their community will reject them. So these are kids who have lived through extreme trauma. On top of that, these are kids who have often participated some of the most egregious human rights violations of the 21st century. These are militias that are often merciless and brutal. And these are kids that their entire psychic being has broken down. They can't tell the difference between hate and affection, anger and cooperation. I mean, all the sort of normal social interactions that you get, they've had none of that. So for the most part, the key is to create a normalized environment for these kids. So it's making it possible for them to get out of the militias, to go back into communities that will support them, to get back into school, to run, which is part of what our work is. We run catch-up learning programs because if you have a 17-year-old that's been fighting for 10 years, they don't want to go back to grade 1. There's, you know, a shame associated and stigma associated with that. So it's creating that enabling environment. But ultimately what helps these kids the most is peace and development. If those kids continue to be surrounded by war, they continue to be re-traumatized. And it's very, very difficult for them to recover. And some of them don't. I mean, some of these are kids who, by their very nature, end up being sociopaths. And the trick, the challenging part, is to identify those kids that you actually can work with and that will be successful through that rehabilitation process.
Can you share an anecdote about a particular child that was a success story, maybe without mentioning names, but maybe a country and what the situation was?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's interesting. I've been to the Congo several times, Eastern Congo, formerly Zaire, which is a brutal war. I mean, they've lost about 5 million people since 1997. It's considered the worst war in African history, and certainly the worst war since World War II in terms of the numbers of civilians killed. And about 6 or 7 years ago, when we were setting up, when War Child was setting up its program in Eastern Congo, we were looking at different communities and interviewing kids. And many of those kids, ex-combatants, and I write about some of these kids in the book, would sit across from me and would say that they just can't, they'd been demobilized, but they just couldn't wait until their 18th birthday when they could go back and join the militias legally because they'd been surrendered as a result of the UN peace process, because there was nothing for them, and they were angry and bitter and resentful and illiterate and felt really hopeless about the future. And within those communities, we ended up rehabilitating the schools, training the teachers, running catch-up learning programs, doing radio sensitization around child rights, working with those kids to rebuild the schools and train them as carpenters so that they had income-generating opportunities as well. And 6 years later, you know, we have literally, we've got about 30 of these schools now that graduate about 300 to 400 kids on average each year. And you talk to many of those same kids, they're in college, they're in university, they want to be doctors and lawyers, they want to run their country. And it's not even that expensive. It's amazing what a transformational impact you can have on a child's life just by creating those opportunities and fostering that normative environment for them.
So, and you've obviously seen successes in other places as well, and it's a shame that, given that the cost is relatively small and that there are many organizations that are ready, willing, and able to help, that we're not in a position to fix these situations and help these children and others more often. Is there anything that we can do as individuals to put pressure on our governments to get them to take these efforts more seriously? And we were talking at the beginning about how we may inadvertently be contributing to some of these problems. Can you talk about that too?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, one of the ways that we can make an impact is by increasing our aid contributions. And I know it seems hard when you think about the economic recession, which has certainly had a devastating impact here in the United States. And it's hard for people to think about helping beyond our borders. But it's an investment in all of our futures. You know, to create a situation where young people are out of militias and don't have access to weapons and are not promoting a cycle of violence and tyranny anywhere in the world. It's for all of our benefit. So certainly our aid dollars do matter. And there are two ways that you give to aid. One is through government contributions, through what's called Official Development Assistance, or ODA. In the United States, it's about 0.17% of the national wealth. The UN target is 0.7, so a long way away from achieving the UN target of 0.7. In total, the U.S. gives the largest amount of aid money to programs around the world, but as a percentage of wealth, it's one of the lowest among industrialized countries. So that's something for policymakers to consider, because war is expensive, but peace is cheap. It's just harder to do, and it requires a sustained investment. The second part that people can do, obviously, is to get involved with an international organization and to donate. And I always recommend the same thing to people. We see images on the TV, we respond to crises like Haiti, and we throw money at it, and then a year later we go, well, why didn't that get any better? And these are structural deficits. It takes a long time for things to get better. And I usually encourage people, if you do want to give, that's a wonderful act of generosity and kindness. But I recommend actually you either give monthly a smaller amount of money to allow for sustainable programming, or you take that check when you feel compelled to act, and you divide it in two, and you post-date the second half to the following year, because that's often when the needs are just as great, but when the cameras have gone home and no one's paying attention, and organizations just don't have the resources that they need. So those are two ways that people can help. The third way is just by being more informed, to take the time to read, even read one piece of international news each week, to read a couple of books or watch a television segment that has to do with issues that are happening outside of our borders, because it's amazing how much that will impact your thinking and encourage globally responsive action.
So your goal in writing the book was to, I guess, put a global spotlight on these problems, to show in totality what we're dealing with. What do you hope to accomplish with the book?
Well, the book, to be honest with you, it's really a reflection on the past 16 years of working in some of the most challenging environments around the world. But it is a book about the factors that lead to war and that makes the case for prevention and how we might actually achieve a sustainable peace in different parts of the world. And I make it sound like it's very heavy and very dark and depressing. It actually, the personal stories really anchor the arguments that I'm making in the book, which is about how we're connected to conflicts in other parts of the world, how we finance those conflicts, and what it is that we might do differently. And there are moments of humor, moments that I hope, the stories of people that I have met, that will inspire and move people and also make them more aware of what's going on.
And how much of this is caused by what we do maybe as consumers? How does that contribute to these to these conflicts? You have some examples you can share.
Absolutely. You know, we contribute in ways that we often don't appreciate. War is in everything we do. We are consumers of war. It is in our pension funds, many of our teachers' pension funds. It's in through our arms export policies that often end up in the hands of illegitimate or reckless regimes around the world and then end up being used against civilians. It's in our cell phones in the form of conflict resources that are mined in places like the Eastern Congo, gold and tungsten and coltan, which is in literally every one of our cell phones and our video game consoles and our computers or other electronics devices. It's filling up our cars. It's encircling our ring fingers in the form of conflict diamonds. So we think of war as being a problem that happens over there, but we are surrounded by it. We are immersed in it, and we often end up financing conflict and instability, sometimes by the very things that we do every single day and not being aware of it.
How do you stay optimistic? You're out in the midst of this all the time, and you seem to be upbeat, regularly upbeat. What drives you? What keeps you thinking that, you know, tomorrow we'll fix this? Tomorrow we'll get our hands around these challenges?
It's not always easy, and certainly there are moments for me that have been extremely frustrating. It's not always the things that people expect. One of the most frustrating things for me in my work is to see a fantastic program that's working, making a huge difference, that's ending that cycle of violence and poverty, and you just don't have the resources or the commitment to be able to keep going, or the security situation changes. So that's frustrating. But the work itself is extremely inspiring. There are many countries where we have been operating for close to a decade, and we are seeing that generational change. Places like Afghanistan, where we work with women and children, places like Darfur, where we're working in camps for internally displaced, doing education and skills training for young people, keeping them out of the militias. And when you see that progress, that's when you believe that there is going to be a better day, and that's what keeps me positive.
You've been at this a little more than a decade and a half. What do you see as the priorities for the next decade? More of the same, or do you anticipate going in different directions?
For me personally, or for the...
For you personally.
For me personally, well, I just wrote my first book, and writing has always been something that I've done a lot of. I've never done a long form, so this was an experiment. Done a lot of magazine and newspaper writing. I do want to continue to have conversations around global issues and how we might do things differently. So for me, I want to continue with my work at War Child, to continue writing, to continue speaking, and continuing to advocate for socially responsible global policies and programs.
Is there any one issue that you would like to see resolved in the coming year, something that you think is doable within a 5-year period or a 10-year period, so that we can say at the end of that time, we have conquered this, we have fixed this problem, and we have rid the world of this danger?
I think there are a number of opportunities. That the problem is going to be, is there sufficient political will to achieve that? I think it is possible in the next 5 years to stop the use of child soldiers in many war-torn countries around the world by holding those accountable who would abuse and exploit children in this fashion. And we're starting to see some tremendous progress on that front through the work of the International Criminal Court, trying in particular many of the those who recruited and abused children in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. But the other way that you can address this issue is by ensuring that in conflict states there are opportunities for young people through employment, education, skills training. It's really just about the financial investment. And I guess where I do get a bit cynical is whether or not there's sufficient political will to tackle this issue and to make that kind of investment. There was a lot of momentum around this issue about 10 years ago with the optional protocol on child soldiers to try to curb this practice. But now that we have the legislation in place, what we really need are the mechanisms to go after those who are abusing children in this fashion.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Nutt.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Garcia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.